So, think about a division, right? Like one that seems totally permanent. It defines an entire era.
Right. Solid.
Then, boom, it just dissolves almost overnight. That's pretty much what happened on November 9th, 1989 with the Berlin Wall.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that things we see as fixed barriers can just crumble under the right circumstances.
A structure that for, what, nearly 30 years was the symbol of the Cold War split? East Germany, West Germany?
Mm-hmm. A physical scar, really,
Mm-hmm.
right across Europe. And then suddenly,
Hmm.
it was just obsolete, almost irrelevant overnight. It's still kind of stunning when you think about the speed of it.
Definitely. And in this deep dive, we're not just, running through a checklist of dates. We want to get into the cascade of events, the decisions, and maybe the lack of decisions.
Some crucial moments.
And the people, the movements on the ground that all came together to bring that wall down. We've got some great source material here, excerpts looking at the history, the buildup, the night itself, and everything that followed.
Yeah, our mission, I think, is to dig a bit deeper than the usual timeline, understand the key forces at play, and what this whole dramatic episode tells us about power, about freedom.
And about how quickly things can actually change.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's set the stage. To really get why the fall was so huge, we need to understand how the wall even happened. Back to post-World War II.
Absolutely. Germany gets carved up. 4 occupation zones, US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. Standard stuff, spoils of war.
But Berlin was the tricky part, right? Deep inside the Soviet zone.
Precisely. Berlin itself was also divided into 4 sectors. So you had this outpost, this island of Western control, smack bang in the middle of the Soviet sphere of influence.
Which you could imagine was always going to be a flashpoint, this ideological battleground right there.
Oh, definitely. And as the wartime alliance crumbled and the Cold War kicked in the West versus the Soviets, those occupation zones hardened. Germany, and especially Berlin, became the absolute front line, the most visible symbol of this global divide.
Okay, so tensions are high for years. Then, August 1961, the wall goes up. It seemed pretty sudden to people in the West, didn't it? What was the trigger?
Well, the trigger was the sheer number of East Germans leaving, heading west mostly through Berlin because the sector borders were still relatively open at that point.
So people were voting with their feet.
Massively. They were seeking political freedom, sure, but also just better economic opportunities. East Germany was hemorrhaging skilled workers, professionals. It was a huge brain drain and a real blow to the government's legitimacy.
So they felt cornered.
Pretty much. With Soviet backing, they decided on this drastic measure: seal the border, build the wall.
And it was huge, wasn't it? Like 155 kilometers all around West Berlin.
That's right. Its main purpose wasn't really keeping Westerners out. It was about keeping East Germans in. That's the grim reality. It trapped its own population.
Chilling. So it physically cut off West Berlin entirely from East Berlin and all of East Germany.
Completely severed it. Concrete, barbed wire, watchtowers, armed guards, the works. An unprecedented barrier designed purely to stop its own citizens from leaving.
What must that have been like, living with that division day in, day out?
Just imagine. Families split down the middle. You couldn't just pop over to see your relatives.
Mm-hmm.
Communities that had existed for centuries suddenly sliced in two.
And life in the East. Heavy restrictions.
Very much so. Strict travel rules, limited access to news and information from the West, and, of course, the Stasi, the secret police. Constant surveillance, informants everywhere. It created this pervasive atmosphere of, well, suspicion and fear.
While on the other side, West Berlin was deliberately propped up by the West, wasn't it? Like a showcase.
Exactly. A vibrant, subsidized symbol of Western freedom and prosperity right there for East Germans to see, or at least hear about. The contrast was stark, unavoidable. It just kept highlighting the differences.
So this deep division exists for decades, feels permanent. Then we get to the 1980s. What starts to shift? What were the first cracks?
Well, the big one is Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in the Soviet Union in '85.
Right, glasnost and perestroika.
Exactly. Glasnost openness. Perestroika restructuring. His goal was internal to revitalize the Soviet system. But the unintended consequence was huge for Eastern Europe.
Because he sort of signaled the Soviets wouldn't necessarily intervene militarily anymore.
That was key. He effectively ditched the Brezhnev doctrine, the idea that Moscow had the right to step in and crush dissent in satellite states. That fear, the fear of Soviet tanks, which had kept things locked down for decades, started to fade.
Which must have emboldened people in places like East Germany.
Absolutely. Even though the East German leader, Erich Honecker, was a hardliner, totally resistant to Gorbachev's reforms.
He dug his heels in.
He really did. But underneath, the pressure was building. People were getting restless. You started seeing these mass demonstrations, what became known as the peaceful revolution. People taking to the streets, demanding change, demanding freedom, losing their fear.
And wasn't there also this other factor, East Germans trying to leave through other Eastern Bloc countries?
Yes, that became critical, especially in 1989. Hungary opened its border with Austria in the spring. That created a loophole.
Ah, so they could go to Hungary, then cross to Austria, and then to West Germany.
Exactly. Thousands seized that chance. Later, Czechoslovakia became another route, with East Germans flooding the West German embassy in Prague. This exodus just put immense pressure on the Honecker regime. It showed they couldn't control their own people.
So you've got internal protests growing, people literally escaping through neighboring countries, and the Soviets basically saying, we're not sending tanks.
It really was a perfect storm gathering.
Hmm.
The regime was looking increasingly isolated, increasingly fragile. The foundations were definitely crumbling.
Which brings us to that incredible day, November 9th, 1989. What actually happened? Take us there.
Okay, so that evening, Günter Schabowski, he was the party boss for East Berlin, a bigwig in the Politburo, holds a press conference. It was meant to be fairly routine, announcing some new travel regulations, supposedly easing things slightly.
But it didn't quite go smoothly, did it? This is the famous press conference mishap.
It's almost unbelievable, the accidental nature of it. An Italian journalist, Riccardo Erman, asks a crucial question. When will these new rules take effect?
And Schabowski was caught off guard.
Completely. He seems unprepared, shuffles through his papers, looks flustered, and then he mumbles something like, as far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay.
Immediately. Wow, just like that.
That phrase, sofort, unverzüglich, was broadcast live. People heard it on TV, on the radio, and after nearly 3 decades of being locked in, they took it literally. They thought, the wall is open now.
Understandably. So what happened next?
People just started heading to the crossing points. First a trickle, then thousands upon thousands converging on the checkpoints along the wall, driven by hope, disbelief maybe, decades of waiting.
And the border guards, they must have been totally confused.
Utterly bewildered. They had no orders, no instructions for this. Imagine, your job for years, decades even, is stop people crossing, use force if necessary. Now there's this huge peaceful crowd demanding to pass based on something your boss just said on TV.
Chaos. Were they calling theirs superiors?
Frantically trying to get clear instructions? Yes. But the system was paralyzed. No one seemed to know what to do, or no one wanted to take responsibility for either opening the gates or, potentially ordering a crackdown.
So faced with these massive crowds, peaceful but insistent, they just gave way.
Eventually, yes. Harold Jaeger, the commander at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, facing immense pressure and fearing a stampede or violence if things escalated, made the call around 10:45 p.m. He ordered his men to open the gates.
Just like that, the dam broke.
It did. Other checkpoints followed suit. And then just absolute scenes of jubilation. East and West Berliners, separated for generations, streaming through, meeting in the middle, hugging, crying, cheering. Total strangers embracing.
People climbing on the wall.
Yeah, climbing onto the very symbol of their division, dancing, singing, and bringing hammers, chisels, anything they could find, and starting to chip away at it, physically dismantling the barrier.
She's such an iconic image. The sheer joy, the relief must have been overwhelming.
It was pure catharsis, a truly historic, spontaneous eruption of freedom and unity. Unforgettable.
And things moved incredibly fast after that night. The fall of the wall wasn't the end, but the beginning of the end for East Germany.
Exactly. It unleashed forces that couldn't be contained. The political landscape shifted dramatically, leading incredibly quickly to formal German reunification.
Less than a year later, right? October 3rd, 1990.
That's the date. But getting there involves some really complex negotiations. You had the 2 German states, obviously, but also the 4 World War II Allied powers, the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. They all had to agree on the terms.
Security concerns, borders, Germany's place in NATO. Lots to sort out.
A huge diplomatic effort, the 2+4 agreement. And then internally, the massive challenge of actually merging 2 countries that had lived under completely different systems for over 40 years.
Yeah, the economic side must have been daunting. East Germany's economy was lagging, to put it mildly.
Hugely. It needed enormous investment, total restructuring to catch up with the West. And socially, bridging the gaps in living standards, ways of life, even mindsets. That was, and in some ways still is, a massive undertaking.
There was dislocation, wasn't there? Unemployment in the East as old industries collapsed.
Yes, the transition to a market economy was a shock for many in the East. While necessary for long-term integration, it caused significant hardship and resentment initially, created a sense of being taken over for some. It's a reminder that reunification wasn't a smooth, easy process for everyone.
Looking beyond Germany, the fall of the wall was obviously a pivotal moment globally, the symbolic end of the Cold War, almost.
Absolutely. It signaled the collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. One by one, the communist regimes fell, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and then, just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The Cold War was well and truly over.
And Europe entered a new era. Expansion of the EU, NATO moving eastward.
A whole new European order emerged in the 90s, aiming for, a continent whole and free, though, of course, that process brought its own set of challenges and debates that continue today.
Now, looking back with hindsight, our sources mention some lingering debates or controversies around the wall's fall. What are those?
Well, one is the perennial question about external influence versus internal change. How much was it driven purely by the East German people themselves? And how much did Western policies, media broadcasts, maybe even covert actions, play a role in encouraging dissent?
It's probably a mix, right?
It almost certainly is.
Yeah.
The internal pressure was undeniable, the courage of the protesters was central. But the external context, the lure of the West, Gorbachev's stance, it all played into it.
And the other point seems to be the economic consequences of reunification we touched on.
Yes, the lingering disparities. Even decades later, there are economic differences between East and West Germany. Some argue the rapid shock therapy approach to economic transition caused long-term damage and social friction in the East, contributing to feelings of being left behind.
So, lessons learned. What are the big takeaways from this whole story?
I think, first and foremost, it's just this incredible example of people power. Nonviolent, sustained protest achieving profound political change. The peaceful revolution really showed that.
It also seems to show how brittle authoritarian regimes can be, even when they look strong on the surface.
Definitely. The East German state seemed unshakable for decades. But when the fear lifted and they couldn't rely on force in the same way, it just crumbled incredibly quickly. It shows that legitimacy ultimately comes from the people, not the secret police.
Leaders ignore that at their peril.
Exactly. And another interesting lesson, almost ironic, is about communication. Schabowski's bungled statement.
Yeah, one poorly phrased sentence triggering history.
It really highlights how crucial clear communication is, especially in tightly controlled systems, and how unpredictable things can become when information suddenly flows differently. It feels very relevant today in our age of instant global communication and potential misinformation.
And the human element is so strong here. We talked about the escapes.
Oh, absolutely. The famous photo of Konrad Schumann, the young border guard leaping over the barbed wire back in '61, that's an enduring symbol.
A symbol of defiance.
And all the other stories, the tunnels people dug, the homemade hot air balloons, the dangerous swims, they all speak to this fundamental human desire for freedom, the risks people will take.
It's vital that we remember those stories and the wall itself, the remaining sections, the memorials.
Like the East Side Gallery, the Berlin Wall Memorial at Bernauer Strasse, Checkpoint Charlie Museum. They're not just tourist spots. They're essential reminders. They teach about the cost of division, but also the possibility of overcoming it. The wall lives on in memory as this symbol of tyranny defeated.
And it makes you think about other walls, other divisions that still exist today. Korea, the Israeli West Bank barrier.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that Berlin wasn't unique in the idea of division, even if its fall was spectacular. These walls often represent deeper conflicts, but Berlin also shows they aren't necessarily permanent.
And its legacy extends to modern debates too, doesn't it? Freedom of movement, surveillance, digital borders.
For sure. The questions raised by the Berlin Wall about controlling populations, about liberty versus security, they resonate strongly in our digital age.
So if we were to boil down some practical lessons for leaders.
Listen to your people. Be transparent. Cooperate internationally. Authoritarianism is ultimately unstable.
For citizens, activists.
Change is possible through peaceful means. Collective action matters. Individual voices count. And never ever take freedoms for granted. They need protecting.
And for educators or just anyone learning from history.
Go beyond the facts. Connect with the human stories, the emotions, understand the why and the how, not just the what and when, and draw those parallels to today.
Looking back then, the fall of the Berlin Wall really was more than just a date in a history book.
Oh, much more. It was a victory for the human spirit, wasn't it? A collective refusal to live behind concrete and barbed wire. A demand for freedom that, against all odds, succeeded.
The big takeaways seem clear. Hope, Unity, freedom are powerful forces, but also a warning about division, fear, silence.
Exactly. Which leads us to a final thought, maybe for everyone listening. Think about the walls that still exist today. Maybe not concrete ones, but ideological walls, social walls, divisions within communities, maybe even within ourselves.
Yeah.
How can the lessons from Berlin, that message of hope, that demonstration of change, how can that guide us in tackling the barriers we face now? It's definitely something to
Yep.
reflect on.